Okay, time to finally get back to making a video on an actual game. And this time it's possibly the most pointless game to be released in recent years. Woohoo! You might be aware of Skull Island: Rise of Kong. It came out a couple of months ago and was famously terrible. I didn't play it, and I will never play it. There's always a certain fascination around catastrophic failures of games, and some people do actually enjoy playing them just for the laughs, but I guess I don't have that sense of humour. But I watched some videos on it and enjoyed the spectacle of seeing something being righteously torn apart by critics. But now there's this, Monke Island: Rise of the Beast. Or maybe it's pronounced Monk, or simply Monkey. It's one of those meme things that hasn't really permeated my consciousness. I saw this game on the Epic Store and it was pretty obvious what it was, a straight up parody of Skull Island. And indeed, that is what it says on the store page. It also lists a host of hilarious features. 32K resolution, 50,000 FPS, made on Unreal Engine 6, stuff that just barely qualifies as humorous. Now this is not the sort of thing I would normally play, but there was one other thing that stood out to me on the store page. The storage space required was 600 megabytes. That signifies two things. First, it would be a really quick download. Second, it would probably be a very short experience. Turns out I was right on both counts. Plus it was free. I would not be dropping any amount of cash on something like this. But as it is, well hell, maybe that's a clever and amusing bit of satire? The store page didn't really fill me with hope, but at a cost of $0 and a download time of a minute or two, I figured it was worth finding out. First impressions were even worse than I expected. You get a screen asking you to register an account and it won't let you progress until you enter something. The text that you type in is almost the same colour as the background, so that's helpful. I honestly almost just gave up at this point because damned if I'm going to create an account just for a low effort joke. But fortunately it just needed me to enter an email address, any email address. And I'm sorry if someone does actually use fake email at yahoo.com, you may be getting a few unwanted confirmation emails from makers of dodgy meme games. So the game starts with a flyby of the environment, accompanied by a barely comprehensible voiceover.
But of a beast with the strength of 1,000 men, and an instinct for conquest.
This was more in line with what I expected, a fairly basic environment cobbled together from stock Unreal Engine assets. Then you get control of your Monke. It's this one, I think, a model and animations that costs $15 on the Epic Store. It's not terrible as such, but it looks worse in game than it does on the model's promotional video. I don't think the animations have been implemented particularly well and the lighting is not great. As for the handling, I was using an Xbox controller and it was way too sensitive. It was also set to non-inverted, which for me is an issue. Unsurprisingly, there's no option to change either the sensitivity or the non-inversion. I did do a second playthrough afterwards with mouse and keyboard, and I admit that was much better. And yes, that's right, I, who struggle to finish even good games, played through this one twice. You might be able to infer from this just how long it is. Anyway, you run along for a bit and encounter a few insectile creatures which you melee to death with the game's one attack button. This is not enjoyable. You are then presented with a lake strewn with large boulders which you must use to get to the other side. Using a controller with way too much sensitivity and non-inversion that you're not used to, it's a frustrating challenge. Using a mouse and keyboard, it was a lot easier. But either way, it was not enjoyable, even if the jumping animation is kind of amusing. And then at the other side of the lake, there are some more enemies. Kill them and the game tells you this is just the beginning. It then ends. Anyone who's used Unreal Engine will recognise that these credits use the default font. So that's Monke Island: Rise of the Beasts. Having completed this epic adventure not once but twice, my main question is, why does this exist? And I don't mean that as a rhetorical question, I genuinely think it's interesting to consider why something like this was made and why it was published. As a game, well, it's nothing. It has no value whatsoever. It's the sort of thing that I, or indeed anyone with a computer and access to a few basic tutorials on Unreal Engine, could create in an afternoon. And, you know, that's okay. It's supposed to be a joke that's free to download from the Epic Games Store and takes 5 or so minutes to experience. It's not supposed to be a game, it's a parody. And as a parody of something bad, if it was actually good, that would arguably diminish the effect. Unfortunately, however, it doesn't work as a joke either, because, well, there's just nothing funny about it. Okay, a terrible King Kong game was released, so you've made a worse King Kong game. That's it. That's the extent of the parody, that's the whole of the joke. There's no insight, there's no humour, outside the rather weak attempts on the store page. And it's clear that the game isn't bad because skillful designers intentionally made it bad. It's bad because a not very skillful designer made it with no effort. Well, maybe that's unfair. I can't really comment on the designer's skill level, but I do think I can comment on how much effort they put into this, and it's zero. Again, you may say, of course it's a parody of a low-effort game. If they put effort into it, that would defeat the purpose. But this I do not agree with. Yes, a parody game doesn't have to be a good game, but it should at least attempt to be a good parody. This does not do that. Then there's the question of why the game is on the Epic Games Store and how it came to enter my consciousness. The Epic Store is not a paragon of good design in my opinion. It has limited functionality, discoverability is not great, there aren't many options for tailoring the experience to your particular tastes. So what you see is what they want to show you. Scroll down a little from the main featured products and you'll see a list of top sellers, most played games and the top upcoming wishlisted games. Unsurprisingly, Monke Island was not featured on these lists. Scroll down a little further, however, and you see new releases, top player rated games, and games coming soon. Again, unsurprisingly, Monke Island was not featured on the second of these, but I did see it on the coming soon list, and then naturally on the new releases list once it was actually published. And okay, the game can fairly claim a place on these lists, it is a new release, can't deny that. But really, should it be there at all? The amount of shovelware on digital storefronts has been an issue for a while. I can clearly remember the early days of Steam, when it seemed like a veritable treasure trove of digital delights and every new release was an exciting event. That was a long, long time ago. Check out all the new releases on Steam now and, well, the quality is mixed to say the least. And so many sex games. Not that I object to sex games, but even they need some form of quality control. Of course, Steam has well-evolved tools and strategies to ensure that, for the most part, the cream rises to the top, and most of the games you see are at least somewhat worthy of your consideration. That said, I see Magic Pussy Chapter 2 is on the new and trending list, and if that's your sort of thing, cool, but no man, I feel like the stodgy old man I basically am when I say this, but it kind of lowers the tone. But yeah, there is some form of quality control on Steam, imperfect as it is. The quality control on Epic Games Store, though, well, it still has a lot of evolving to do. Shovelware has been showing up with greater regularity in recent years, and since the whole thing is rather unwieldy to actually use, that means you end up seeing more of it whether you want to or not. Now, is this the worst thing in the world? Well, no. And I want to be very clear, I think something like Monke Island has the absolute right to exist. I think it's good that someone was able to make it and distribute it, even if I don't think there was any real value in doing so. But I do think it's good that anyone can make anything and potentially find an audience for it. And marketplaces like Steam and EGS provide effective and efficient ways for developers to do that. I just think that Epic Games Store in particular needs to focus on ways to facilitate open distribution without negatively impacting the customer's experience and drowning out good games with a deafening choir of crap. How best to do that? Well, people have been attempting to answer that question for years now, so I'm not likely to come up with a good solution. I think it just comes down to balance. Most of a digital storefront should be dedicated to a curated selection of quality products that highlights a diverse range of games, while also giving users the option to customize what they see based on their preferences. But everything else shouldn't just be relegated to rot together in the same pile. Ideally, a storefront should make an effort to identify the diamonds in the rough that languish in the virtual wilderness. Incidentally, this is why I think the general gaming community can be a great thing. I have much respect for YouTubers and others who roam courageously through that wilderness, beating back the thorny vines of shovelware, wading through the swamps of barely finished prototypes, to bring us news of some remarkable, obscure indie classic. I just worry that the vines may get too tough, the swamps may get too deep, and having a curated selection of games at the forefront is problematic in some ways, as proper curation requires real people and is subject to bias and shifts based on trends. But big storefronts like Steam and EGS could and should be able to do it properly. I talked a little while back about being a wannabe game dev, so of course I have a lot of empathy for anyone who's trying to get their games seen by people. But conversely, I also have some resentment for people like the developer of Monke Island, who managed to get their game seen by, well, me at least, despite putting zero effort into it. Makes the thousands of hours I've spent on games that never saw the light of day seem even more wasted. Let me reiterate, I don't resent it existing or being distributed, but to see it front and centre on the Epic Games Store, albeit if you scroll down a little, is kind of frustrating. Well, maybe in the coming year I'll finally get off my ass and release a game into the wild. It really couldn't be worse than Monke Island. Until that happens though, get off my lawn.